Hello, I'm Angel, and welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you're a subscriber. Today we're talking about revising and editing. So let's get to it. I'd like to thank my friend Maggie for her input on this video. So, revising and editing are not the same thing, but they can happen at overlapping times. Some people like to crank out a full draft before they go back and do any revising or editing. I'm not like that. As I talked about in a previous video, I write and research at the same time, and I like to get feedback throughout the process. So I am editing and revising as I'm writing and researching. Editing is something I think people might consider proofreading, looking for the typos, the grammar mistakes, the sort of stylistic errors. Revising is the heavy lifting part. It's the adding, deleting, reorganizing the information. So one of the first things I do when I come to a portion of what I'm working on and I'm ready to start getting feedback is editing. I'll run it through a grammar and spell checker. I really like using Grammarly. It has been my experience the professors who are about 70 or so do not like the comma after the introductory clause, and Grammarly's algorithm likes to recommend that, so I just skip that recommendation. Other than that, I've had no issues with Grammarly at all. It's been a huge help to me. After the grammar spell check, I will put my paper into a program that will read it to me, and I follow along and I make corrections as I go. Sometimes I hear things that just don't sound right, so a stylistic or syntax error, or it's just the wrong word. I managed to choose the wrong word, or I just wrote the wrong word. And I do that twice. After I've had it read to me, I'll turn around and read it a second time through the program. After that, I'll run it through Grammarly just to make sure that I didn't mess anything up. And then I send it out for the feedback sessions. The people who read my papers, they might see other small things and point it out, but that is not what I'm looking for from them. I really want them to concentrate on the content, and having a good readable paper enables them to really stay focused on the content. Once I have feedback, I start the revising process. So I'm revising as I'm researching, as I'm writing. I'll do the rewriting where I will take away things that my feedback readers thought was irrelevant. I'll stuff things in that make my case stronger. I will reword transitions, finding better word pairs, things to sort of smooth out the transitions even more. Feedback doesn't have to come from a fellow historian, although that is helpful when it comes to the historiography portion, but every field understands what a thesis is, and they're going to be able to give you feedback on whether or not they feel that you've proven your thesis. I highly recommend using your university's Writer's Center. And if they have the option where you send it in and they send you back the feedback, do that, because it is a huge time saver. I like to print that feedback out and I highlight as I make changes. That way I know that I haven't skipped anything. One of the hurdles to using the feedback through email service is that you have to be very specific about what you want them to look for, because you can't go back later and say, hey, what did you think about this? This is really good because I started doing this when I was an undergrad, and it made me think while I was writing what I wanted them to look at, and so it made me hyper tentative to those areas. I frequently ask for feedback on, is my thesis clear? Are my transitions smooth? Did I do adequate signposting? And then I end with something along the lines of, is there any part that was confusing? And this is where it's really good to have somebody who's not in your field, because now you can take that information and go back. And you want to make your paper as accessible as possible and having people not in your field read it and give you that clarifying feedback can really help make it accessible. Get a frenemy. You know who your frenemies are. There's people who are gonna nitpick the tiniest detail. Yeah, it's gonna hurt a lot more than if a friend or a classmate gave you the same feedback because they're not your friend, but it is what you need. So once I have a completed draft, from beginning to end, I've gotten my last round of feedback from my friends, I set the project aside for as long as possible. Sometimes it's only a day, sometimes it's a weekend. But if you have more time, put it aside for more time. Read it and see what no longer fits and cut it out. Even if it's well written. And an interesting side note, you do not have room for side notes. You need to have that space for your primary points to support your thesis. And just because you've cut it from your paper doesn't mean that you've cut it from your mind. You still have it in your journal. When people talk to you about your research, you can pull out that interesting tidbit. I often ask authors, what is the most interesting thing that you learned that didn't make it into the book? Because one, they've always responded really well to that question, and two, it shows that I'm not the only one out there cutting stuff. The next thing I like to do is make sure that the organization still makes sense, because I've been adding and deleting. I want to make sure that from beginning to end, it's still a coherent piece. Read your paper like you're skimming a book. When I skim, I read the first and last sentences in a paragraph, and these are really where you want to make sure you have clear topic sentences and excellent transition sentences. And this is great if you've been moving things around because you might need to rework some of those areas. Look at your section headings or your chapter titles to make sure that they still make sense. Tighten up your prose. I write and speak from the position that prepositions are like carbs. I want more all the time. I know this about myself, and so I know that at some point I'm gonna need to go through and find the extra unnecessary prepositions. I call it prep hunting. I'll put a list of the top 50 in the description box below. I use the find tool in Word, type in the prepositions and just highlight them. After I've hunted for all 50 of these offending prepositions, I go through and look for where I can rewrite the sentences without the prepositions. Sometimes it's really easy. Other times the sentence has to be completely rehashed. This technique has really sharpened and clarified my writing. Prep hunting can also help with passive voice. Some professors will crush your psyche if you ever, even once, use passive voice. I think that's a little harsh. I think passive voice can be an effective way to communicate, but mostly it's not. So if you're gonna write in passive voice, have a really good reason. Otherwise, just rewrite the sentence. My last piece of advice is this. If you've written something that's really important to you, like capstone, thesis, etc., find a professional editor. Do everything I already talked about, and then send it to a pro. It will cost money, start saving now, but it is worth it. And that's all I've got for this video. What are some of your tips for revising and editing? Leave them in the comments section below so that everybody can learn. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.